So what is access to freedom in the digital age? We've got a panel discussion now. We've got the Chief Executive of the Eldesohn Foundation, Robert McQueen. We've got the Chief Executive of the UK Body for Open Technology, Amanda Brooke. We've got the Senior Technical Staff Member of the Open Source Ecosystem at IBM, David Eldesohn, and it's going to be moderated, this panel, by David Wood. They're going to explore what free and open source software is and the ways in which these freedoms can feed into digital autonomy and integrity in the 21st century.
Welcome to this session on open source and freedom in the digital age. My name's David Wood. Rather a long time ago, I was heavily involved in a project to convert into open source an entire smartphone operating system, Symbian OS, that had started its life as proprietary software. That was, let's say, quite an experience. I retain to this day a close interest in both the opportunities and risks of free and open source software. Our three panelists today are going to bring us bang up to date with what these risks and, more importantly, the opportunities are. Let's start with a few words of introduction from all three. David Eldesohn, over to you.
Oh, thanks, David. Thanks very much for the opportunity to participate with this. My name is David Eldesohn. I am a senior technical staff member at IBM, focusing on the open source ecosystem, and also a member of the GCC steering committee.
Thanks. Amanda.
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me along today. I'm Amanda Brooke. I'm CEO at Open UK. I have been in that role now for 15 months. We are the industry organisation for the business of open in the UK. And we don't just look at open source software, we look at the three opens of open technology: open source software, open hardware, and open data. You take me back mentioning Symbian. So I was at Canonical for 5 years, where I was general counsel, starting in early 2008, when Symbian was big news back then, actually, before it went off to Nokia. Looking forward to talking to you today.
Well, we could talk more about Canonical and Ubuntu as well, but let's see where else we need to talk about. Rob, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, hi there. I'm Rob McQueen. Very glad to be here. I am currently the CEO of the Eldesohn Foundation. So we're a US-based nonprofit aiming to tackle the digital divide. So looking at particularly access to devices and connectivity that let people access the digital economy. I'm also serving as the current president of the GNOME Foundation. I've been involved in free and open source software, particularly around the desktop, for around 20 years, as well as working in consultancy, bringing open source into business contexts, including Nokia and Scion. So moving it out of parallel tracks with you, David.
Great. Well, let's get the conversation going. What is special and good and important about free and open source? Why should we be spending some time discussing that? David.
Well, free and open source software are very effective ways for collaboration around the world. And it allows people to have full visibility into the software, full visibility into the data for open data. So it's very helpful for people to be able to ensure that software is reliable and utilize the great domain knowledge of people around the world to collaborate and innovate.
And that requires open source, does it?
Yes, open source software is the ability, a license that allows people to collaborate and all contribute to the development of the software, so that people can see the basis, the foundation for the software, how it's interacting together, and ability to collaborate and ensure that the software is functioning well and that everybody is able to understand the abilities of this software.
Amanda, anything to add?
Yeah, picking up on what David was saying, I think licensing is very important, but with open source, what we're looking at is fundamentally a way to collaborate that allows us to collaborate globally and to bring together all sorts of different and diverse contributors, whether that's to the code itself or all the work that goes around it. And I think we've seen through the pandemic a really good example in the test and trace apps. So as those have been developed, some more successfully than others, and I'm sure we could all give opinions on those for the next hour at least, but those apps have had at their center the need to be transparent and the need to build public trust, citizen trust for governments. And I think it's really noticeable that almost all of them have been open source with varying degrees of success in that process also. But I think that really shows you the value of having many eyes on code, many people looking for the bugs and the fixes, looking at the security. And I think generally it's accepted today that it allows you to produce the best software through collaboration.
Rob, do you agree? Anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think what David and Amanda have said is very correct. But to me, there's an additional sort of angle that I would add, which is thinking about the role of free and open source communities and the software that they're built around as a kind of equalizer for access to technology. So if you've got the ability to kind of engage in software being created and software being modified and deployed, then you have that opportunity to kind of take a seat at the table and to steer things in a direction that helps you, your community, or people like you. And I think that's a really essential way to kind of avoid this kind of tech imperialism, right? If actually we go out with this kind of equal approach to bring people into forming the technology that can affect their own lives. So this idea that it's a conversation rather than the idea of exporting. This is a commercial product; it's in a box, and I'm going to ship it over here, and that's my decision, and you're sort of on the receiving end of that. So it's
interesting. Interesting phrase, tech imperialism. One of the giants of technology is, of course, IBM. David, are you part of the imperium of technology? Maybe you can just explain why IBM thinks differently about open source.
Well, I mean, I guess I am historically, and IBM has made a wonderful change as many other companies, not just IBM. I mean, Microsoft, Amazon, a lot of companies are shifting now and seeing the benefits of open source software, seeing the benefits of being able to utilize all of this incredible innovation and apply this on IBM's platforms to be able to meet the needs of our IBM's customers who are adopting all of this software for this amazing innovation that's occurred in the world with, as you're talking about, whether it's tracing, whether it's for science, whether it's all of this work with Spark. I mean, all of this work with machine learning, deep learning. There's just been an incredible amount of acceleration because of the great knowledge and skills of people around the world and the sort of leveling of the playing field that open source has provided. It used to be that people only had access to a small number of computers in the world, and one needed to work for a Hewlett Packard or an IBM or a Digital in order to be able to work on major pieces of software. There was this great innovation that occurred with the commoditization of hardware with PCs and the ARM Acorn computer around the world, and with the access to that hardware, then people were wanted to explore how to utilize that hardware, and that developed the ability of such as Linux and open source software, and people trying to utilize this software on this various commodity hardware, and that sort of commoditized the software as well, with people now around the world, whether it's the United States, Canada, or England, to Azerbaijan, to China, to anywhere in Africa. I mean, giving all of these people access, and with the ARM that you're aware of Raspberry Pi and these very inexpensive systems that are very, very powerful now. That people can utilize this around the world, explore, develop the software, and it's allowed this all this individual pieces of knowledge around the world of specialized pieces of software, this library, that library, compositing it all together to create new and innovative products. And so it's that ability that has allowed the technology to rapidly innovate and to provide some really incredible resources and opportunities that a monolith as a historic company that couldn't do on its own. So now with the collaboration across Google and Facebook and IBM and Red Hat and all these other companies to create OpenShift, to create containers, to create additional security opportunities, all of these incredible opportunities for people and companies to have new resources, new technology at their forefront. I mean, Apple people utilizing new databases. And all of that is the ability of people to have this with domain-specific knowledge, with their own experience and their own challenges. All these different companies have different problems that they're trying to solve, and individuals and these people are able to work together to find new and innovative ways to solve these problems that they couldn't do in these old sort of vertical castles that we had with proprietary software. There's a role for proprietary and there's a role for open source.
Amanda, you've got some fairly large companies backing Open
We
UK
do.
as well.
We do, and I'm listening to the answer on behalf of IBM with great interest, because I don't think the annals of history will miss the position and the place of IBM in it. It has had a huge impact. They have made a massive, massive investment into open source, and have been behind many of the big initiatives. Things like Open Invention Network wouldn't have happened without them. I think it's interesting that David says all companies have different problems. I probably come from a slightly different perspective. And I think one of the issues we have in technology today is that all companies have, in roundabout ways, probably become software companies. So I think it's fair to say that with digitalization and digital transformation, the phrase we all hate, or love to hate at least, what we've seen is this shift, and a shift so that business either creates its products, distributes them, or has them consumed via software, one way or another. And I think actually what we see is the perfect environment for open source, because many, many companies are trying to achieve the same goals. And some of our old methodologies and our old ways of doing business have really shown themselves to be outdated. And in fact, we live in a world where all driving to those goals, one of the massive benefits of open source is that those companies can come together. Now, sometimes that's companies who are direct competitors. Other times it's companies who are in different market segments or verticals, but they're looking to achieve the same kinds of solutions. And I think that's been a big shift for open source, in that we've seen huge amounts of investment come from corporates. You know, this concept of people sitting in their basements coding, whilst not entirely dead, is less than it was. We have more and more corporate backing for the coders. And I think that's right. I think everybody has to eat. Everybody has to be paid for the job they do. Most of us still give huge amounts of personal time to many projects, as well as the bits that we're paid for in open source. But we've got this perfect moment where companies are really benefiting from the likes of the cloud native work, where we saw Google create Kubernetes and then a whole industry emerge on the back of that. And from some of the other big collaborations, which allow a commoditized product rather than having multiple versions. You get these open de facto standards emerging, and companies can then differentiate themselves other places where, to be honest, it's much more interesting and benefit from those huge collaborations.
So, Amanda, your comment about all companies have to become software companies, it reminds me of the famous quote by Mark Andreessen of Andreessen Horowitz, but originally one of the pioneers of web browsing. He said, software is eating the world. In industry after industry, unless you are excellent in software, you will be outcompeted by others. Is the new phrase, I mean, Rob, coming to you, is the new phrase that open source software is going to eat the world, and unless your company is an expert in open source, you might be left behind? Or is it more complicated than that?
I think it already has. I mean, that kind of maybe doesn't answer the question, because I think the question is answered at a slightly different level, and it's not, do you have to be good at open source software to succeed? I think it's just, do you have to be good at software to succeed? And then, making an informed decision about the landscape of the software world as it is. Do you build that successful answer and that successful business using huge tracts of open source code as part of your solution? Or do you go out and reinvent the wheel and come up with something that's already done better elsewhere, or it's done by a lot more people elsewhere, and you can be a voice at that table? So I think it's a matter of kind of economics and a matter of kind of frugal investment. In my previous work in consultancy, we sort of talked a lot about kind of ever raising table stakes to take part in industries as they become more technically accomplished and technically complicated. And there's a lot of commodity pieces that 30 years ago you would have gone out to license these things potentially, or you would have had to write a lot of these things. Now you can get all of these things done for you, whether that's you install existing software or whether you pay a service provider who's building that entire stack for you with open source and they have the domain expertise. But that allows you as a business to come in and invest up here. Like Amanda was saying, it's all about, what's your competitive advantage? What are you building with all of these kind of great pieces? And as that kind of great equalizer, it's very powerful. These things, code being written in the basement by kind of long-haired hippies or whatever, is now, those hippies are probably still there writing the code, but they might be doing it, on the payroll for an IBM or a Red Hat or something. And equally, you have these kind of huge corporate interests alongside individual interests and things kind of playing out in this community. So I think it's just a better way to do software from the perspectives of efficiency and being able to sort of collaborate and just bring in, there's more people in the world than you. They know more than you. So have a diverse conversation, bring those voices in, and then you'll get a better result.
Is free and open source software always the better way? Are there business requirements or other issues that might lead companies to rationally choose not to use open source software?
I'll jump in there if I may. So I
Please.
worked in a law firm for a couple of years advising people on setting up businesses, and my goal was to work on nothing but open source. And I probably shot myself in the foot because I spent a lot of time with potential entrepreneurs and founders explaining how open source software works. And there's a misconception often that the kind of non-commercial license that you can have in Creative Commons also exists in open source. And it absolutely doesn't. And whether you're looking at the free software definition or the open source definition, you cannot discriminate against field of use. So once you put your software out there on an open source license, others can come and take it. And I think perhaps for companies that don't have a robust enough business model or understand how they can make the revenue they need to survive before they open source their code, they shouldn't do it. So if you are going to be concerned that someone else uses your code for profit, or you are going to be really upset if they make money out of it, particularly if you don't, then you shouldn't do it.
And are there initiatives to change the licensing, to have new versions of the GPL or EPL or?
There have been lots of discussion around it, and I very much doubt that we will see. It's not so much about the licensing as the base definitions, that the standard, the rules that a license has to comply with to make it open or free. And I don't see those changing. There have been active discussions and active consideration, but what we now have is a huge ecosystem that you can't simply shift. Now, that there's ongoing debate at the moment about setting up a third way or a fourth way. A lot of that has come from the cloud providers' utilization of open source, where they can use it without apparently giving back. And that's led some companies, the obvious and famous one from this year is like Elastic, who have moved license away from an open source to a proprietary license. I would say that's not so much about the licensing as the business model, the commercial model, and ensuring if you are building software because you want it to be something that you make money from as a single vendor in particular, then I think you really have to understand how you're going to leverage it before you open source it.
David, anything to add to that?
Well, following up on Amanda's comment about the ability to reuse the software. It's not solely about the business model, which is extremely important, but it's also about any other uses. I mean, another challenge that's happening in open source is, can these various open source developers enforce any limitations on who's going to use the software? In other words, if you agree or disagree with some philosophy, some I mean, should government, this government or that government, be able to use the software? Should this, military, should it be used for this purpose or that purpose? I mean, this is a big challenge. But as with proprietary software, a company owns the software, and it can, as a private company, can choose to whom it sells the software, for whatever purposes, reasoning it has. With open source, there's a lot of challenge of trying to put into the licensing some sort of limitation on who's allowed to use the software, which sort of goes against the original foundation and purpose of open source. So that's another reason to decide, do you want to keep it proprietary? Once you sort of let the genie out of the bottle, the genie's out of the bottle. And is it also, a big question with open source, or whose decision is it? With a corporation, who owns the software. With open source, it's this broader community, and how do you really decide? Who makes the decision on what's an ethical use of the software or not an ethical use of the software?
And David, just to be really clear in that, you can't make that decision. There is no decision in open source to be made. It's a no-brainer. We just share, and that's how it is.
I'm not sure most corporate lawyers would be keen to get to weigh in on that decision either. Like, are the customers evil or not? But I think Amanda's point around the business model is the one that kind of resonated with me, because I think that there are certain business models, if you look at them very narrowly, right? I've got a pot of software, I'm going to capitalize it, it's really valuable, and I'm going to monetize that by charging licensing fees. You can't usually do that with free and open source software, but that's a very narrow view of being a technology company in today's world. You could be providing logistics services and using huge amounts of open source software to do that. You could be providing customer services, managed services, supported, hosted, widgets you stick inside your data center, all kinds of things. And you can do all of that with free and open source software at the core of your business. So it's a very kind of narrow interpretation to say, I absolutely can't use open source software because then I won't have my business model. I think that's trying to kind of hang your hat on a very small hook in what's actually now a much more complicated world.
And I think that's where we're seeing a shift. We're seeing a shift now, and the shift is with governments and VCs and the like, where we look at how you value software and software businesses, and that's starting to move away from the traditional, where you're looking at the value of patents or you're looking at the value of royalty income. And I think that's becoming old hat across the board. And as you see more of the traditional companies like Microsoft, who we might have expected to be one of the last to move over. 20 years ago, Balmer was describing open source as a cancer. Today, they're one of the biggest contributors to open source in the world. So I think we've seen this move away from those old ways of doing things.
We're at the World Ethical Data Forum, and can we just dig in a little bit more to this question of limiting unethical use of the software? Is there anything can be done, or is it just a matter that once it's released, and it's like all technologies, they're subject to dual use?
So it's something I've discussed with a number of founders, because I think we all get it. And we would all like to see people only doing good things. It often goes hand in hand with the kind of people who want to collaborate around open source, that they're going to want their software to be used for good. And there was a whole movement towards an ethical license that was not approved by the Open Source Initiative. And that sparked a lot of conversation. I've suggested that it might be a thing to do to put your notes in the code headers, expressing that you don't want it used for certain purposes, and that won't actually change the license or invalidate the openness of the software, but it still makes a statement. But it's something that is very hard to do within the realms of open.
David or Rob?
It's a tough question, particularly from that kind of corporate or legal perspective, because in a sense, the sort of open source and free software movement being wide open is what has given it this groundswell and this momentum, and why it's very difficult to enter into that sort of community and then try and put a stake in a different place and say, right, I want to be able to control what happens here, or make an ethical determination here. I think, as part of the wider kind of data and ethics debate, I think I have to be, very honest and say that open source software doesn't provide a magical answer to that. If someone is doing something unethical or ill-advised or not thought through with data, they're probably using open source software to do it. And that's just a matter of fact these days. But if you want to set up different paths and different alternatives, it's that much easier to do so, because you equally can take the same software and wield it in a different way and set up a different path. So I think it's just, it's a tool, it's power that's been kind of unleashed that can be wielded for good or for evil. But the fact that such powerful tools are available to all, it's that kind of equality of access that then provides opportunities to come in with new startup businesses, new approaches, big corporates, actors doing whatever it is that they're doing according to their incentive structures, but individuals, people from different communities around the world being able to say, actually, that doesn't work for me. I don't want to see the world work like that. So I'm going to set up my own social network for this community in Mexico, and that's actually going to be much better for me. Thank you. But you wouldn't be able to do that if 99% of the software that you needed wasn't already there for you.
Yeah, exactly. As Rob was saying, the matter that this software democratizes access, and that with the commoditization of hardware, the commoditization of cloud, making that so accessible, the democratization of software, exactly as Rob said, that previously with a few corporations having massive amounts of proprietary software was very difficult for anybody else to break in and be competitive. But now that everyone is utilizing much the same software, whether it's with AI, machine learning, and the data, the training data for that is largely open as well. So everybody has eyeballs on it to make sure that it's safe, but everybody, within economic limits, but can. If you have the right VCs, if you go to the right people, you can create an alternative to this. So if you dislike how some software is being used, you can't really pull back the software, but you can create an alternative. You can create an alternative environment, and that with this broad availability of open source software, I can utilize pretty much the same software that one of these larger corporations doing, and to create, as I said, my own social network. My own, machine learning, my own, business. For a competitive business or a new business, and so it's open source software, provides that ability. And I'm not just doing this in, I can do this around the world. But I can also do this specialized to South America, specialized to Africa. Can utilize the software and leapfrog forward with specific features, benefits, designs of software and services that are unique for those environments, and not restarting that from scratch.
So talking about building alternative social media networks, do any of you think that in 5 years' time we'll be on social media networks that are truly open source, rather than having our data and our apps somehow hidden behind firewalls that we can't control?
I think it depends what you mean by that, and you're probably asking a very broad question that could be unpackaged and unpicked in many different ways. I think for social media, what we will see is a shift, and it may not be towards openness, but we will see a shift in the way it's regulated. The existing regulation has caused a lot of conflict. We've seen that a lot this year from, I guess, Trump in January onwards. That's really been top of the agenda. I've been around quite a long time, and 20 odd years ago, I was in an ISP. I was one of the lawyers back then lobbying to create the laws of the internet and what they ought to be. And we set up things like the distance selling directive and the e-commerce directive and the UK regulations, purposely trying not to give control as an editor to those who ran the platforms. 20 years later, the world is unimaginable in comparison. We could never have seen the shift in social media. We could never have seen a lockdown where people got their news from Twitter. That the law is just not, and the law is always running to catch up. But I think a 20-year-old piece of law trying to regulate something like this now that it just couldn't have imagined the existence of is way, way out of date. And it's so essential to all our lives. We have a lot of issues around freedom of speech there. We have a lot of issues around democratization and protection of kids. And I think we're going to see some really big shifts in that, let alone in the software.
Yeah, and a big challenge is with the democratization is, can you have broader access to this with these large platforms, yes, the software is available, but is the regulation, especially with regulatory capture of some of these larger corporations, a limitation on the ability of open source and open source platforms to truly compete? As Rob was saying, I mean, and Amanda, that all of the software started with open source, with the proverbial long-haired hippies in the basements playing around with this commoditized hardware, and that created this amazing platform, this amazing ecosystem that we're all using. But there are great concerns about security in the software supply chain itself. As this is adopted by more and more major enterprises, financial institutions, there are concerns about where the software is coming from, and is it really safe? There have been a lot of unfortunate, once it becomes a big enough target, you have bad players coming in and trying to use it. So there's been concerns about how to track that software, how to ensure that it's safe. But as that regulation becomes more and more onerous, it becomes a challenge that how to ensure that it still remains a democratized environment, that it's not something so complicated that only major corporations with deep pockets have the ability to conform to this more complicated regulatory infrastructure, to be able to supply the software in a secure way with all of the different rules and expectations that can be enforced. And so there's the challenge going forward is to ensure that this remains a vibrant ecosystem that is available to everyone, that everybody can participate in. Because as we said at the beginning, open source has provided this incredible opportunity for many people around the world with many different ideas and viewpoints to be able to create amazing technology that for the betterment of society. There's challenges, but without that that broad perspective and allowing everybody an entry point, we would be a much less evolved society now.
So what I'm hearing is this is complicated, and the task of coming up with social media systems that serve all of us is hard, but other things being equal, the more open source that's deployed in these networks, the easier it is for public oversight. Rob, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think the kind of forward-looking questions in terms of can I see an open source kind of social media network replacing whatever we have these days in 5 years' time is a kind of funny one, because there is an unpredictability to what's happened in the software space over the past 15 or 20 years, that you would have seen these huge giants with their sort of great sort of proprietary stacks of software, essentially printing money, licensing this, and then this sort of rubbishy kind of academic and sort of free hippie stuff showed up. And now that's everyone's platform, right? That is the platform that everyone uses. That was unpredictable because that you have this kind of myopia when you're looking from that perspective. Amanda works in kind of legal and policy space quite a lot, and so I kind of admire her optimism that a regulatory kind of refresh could come and help. I guess kind of equalize the kind of data and that space a little bit. I would love for that to happen. I think that there's also a big chance that reckoning, that rebalancing could come for a commercial reason or kind of individual reasons, as something better shows up, something better that is more respectful of your data, something that's built out of open source and is more transparent and trustworthy, and that some scandal, an unpredictable kind of global event, whatever it is, makes that more compelling and more engaging than what we currently have. So no one predicted the rise of the companies that we have now, at least most people didn't. I think their sort of demise will be equally unpredictable, it's an evolving space.
There was a brilliant piece. There was a brilliant piece yesterday in the Sunday Times by a chap called Robert Colville, and he described government as the business of databases, and looks at various software and where you see success or products that are software enabled, and talks about where you see success and where you see failure. And where we've seen success is where there are good databases. So he goes back to the pandemic and he talks about test and trace, no existing database, need to get people to sign up, problem. Then he looks at the vaccine rollout in the UK, nice existing GP-based database, well maintained, well managed, tick. And it's really interesting to see that comparison, but just also picking up on what David is saying, when you look at open source today, Rob and I have both been involved in a report that came out last week for Open UK, and applying the economics that the European Commission are using, we're seeing up to 41 billion being contributed to the UK economy each year from open source. So it's really shifted away. This is big business now. It's not just that it's being adopted and used, it's actually generating value into the economy. And to have got to that stage, it's gone through many iterations and stages of governance. So we may not know everybody that's contributed, but we have a level of governance we've never seen before. And I would challenge whether proprietary these days actually can stand behind the same. The proprietary folk get away with a lot because their contracts will have provisions that look like they protect the software. Open source is very, very candid about that and won't give you these big, indemnities unless it's something they know they can indemnify. But I think we've seen a huge shift in that process of value and that process of corporate involvement. And we now have pretty good governance around a lot of open source, if not most of it.
Question of security of the software. Is it always the case that more open source means the software is more secure and therefore more reliable? Or are there cases when if hackers could actually see the source code, they'll be more able to hack into it, and so that there might be some reasons to keep things hidden after all?
I don't think that security through obscurity ever functions in the long term. I mean, it definitely is a way to provide, some short-term, additional security. But the intention, the hope is that with open source is to have many eyeballs on the source code, to have many people reviewing it. And again, not just the source code itself, but with the incredible innovation and these demands, these challenges that open source software has created, it's created sort of an industry for the security itself. There are many more tools now for scanning the software. There are many more ability, interest and focus to try to, both for good and bad. I mean, there's sort of this arms race going on, but to try to find these nefarious uses of software, find incorrect uses. There's been an incredible amount of robustifying of the software through the use of open source and the ability for Google's and Microsoft's and IBM's and others all to be able to look at the software, scan it, and large companies like those and small companies creating new innovative methods along with academics, to explore the software, to find these security challenges, and to be able to fix them, creating new languages, and the pressure from that to move into different ways of development, and just so it's not just the open source software itself for let's say social networks or for machine learning, but the open source software for the security itself, which is innovating extremely rapidly. And again, open source can contribute to that ability of both the improvements in the security analysis of the software, the security policies, the ways to develop this that couldn't be done in a more narrow vertical corporate environment. It's both the software that's being analyzed and the analysis software that are expanding because of the open source ecosystem that's been created over these past 30, 40 years.
Yeah. We've talked about possible. Rob, on you go.
I enjoy the analogy between computer software security and public health. So the idea that if we're all using better software and we can all see it, we can all work on it to improve it, then we'll be aware of, all of the diseases that are around. We'll be able to pull them apart as a society. We'll be able to work quickly together to solve those problems. And that we'll be stronger as a society by sharing the solutions and the problems in a transparent manner. I think, the last year or so has shown we can move if we work together. And I think David's completely right. The pace of kind of discourse and investment and research around computer security is so much faster than you can ever imagine, than in a software world like it was 20 or 30 years ago. The open source software being there is, the library from which, the companies and the researchers and all the actors in the computer security space, they can see everything that's going on. They can sequence all the DNA. They can understand how every, virus and bacteria works. And then they can say, right, that's actually a problem for all of us, and we need to solve that. So there's no question in my mind that the open source software is a kind of prerequisite to that level of kind of discourse and investment as as an industry or as a society. And we're all the better for it.
I am slightly worried about that, because as well as there being a huge security industry, there's also a huge cybercrime industry. There are many hackers who, for various reasons, are trying to make lots of money. And you mentioned it's like public health, being able to spot the DNA. Well, there are people sort of spotting the DNA and figuring out how to target weapons to latch on in various ways. Thankfully, there's no evidence yet that there's been bioengineered viruses, but there may be similar things. So looking ahead, we did talk about maybe there'll be a scandal of some sort, a bit like a Cambridge Analytica scandal, which made people say, oh, we need to do things differently. With my own futurist hat, I'm quite open to the possibility that the scandals that will come will be security scandals. There will be worse problems. What is it? Recently, Microsoft's Exchange email servers have got some problems. I may have misremembered that, but I think there's quite a likelihood that there is going to be a sudden indrawing of breath, and people are going to find one way or another to do things better.
I don't think that's sudden, though, and I don't think it's something that anybody's surprised by. And the example you just gave was a proprietary one, and I believe there have been some quite big proprietary problems recently. And I think it's a fundamental of society now as we all move. You talked about the Horowitz quote, that they're all software companies, and Jim Zemlin's response was that open source has eaten its lunch. I think it doesn't matter whether you're looking at proprietary or open, both have security issues by their nature as software that need to be dealt with and managed. The advantage there of open is the transparency and the collective, and that collective that Rob talked about, where the response to these things and the protection are also a collective, which I think has a bit more power.
So we're running short of time. We're coming towards the end. I wonder if I can try and focus a little bit on some concrete examples. We've talked in extremely interesting ways about some very important general principles, but are there particular examples of breakthroughs with the use of open source that you've seen recently that you'd like to highlight and flag up as deserving more attention, deserving praise?
I'll very quickly say the public cloud, which I think 70 to 90% of is based on open source. And without that cloud, we wouldn't have the services in business or in our private lives that we do.
And for people who don't know what the public cloud is, how does that differ from the, where did you get onto the public cloud?
So your utilization of cloud will split between hybrid, private, and public. And that will be something for most of us in our day-to-day usage we never have to engage with. It's something that's dealt with by those platform companies building. But what you need to know there in answer to your question is really that what we're seeing is open source sitting underneath the cloud that we're all using day in, day out. And actually, there's a huge value to that to all of us.
Yeah. Rob, do you want to? No, I was just going to say that exactly as Amanda was saying, that whether you have a company like Amazon Cloud, IBM Cloud, Oracle Cloud, Google's Cloud, Azure, at Microsoft, it all has this fundamental layer of open source software portability across all of that, which allows this great competition. And IBM is a leader in the hybrid cloud and helping customers to utilize all of these different platforms. And this open source is the on-ramp and the window that allows everybody to have that competition, that commonality. And similarly, other amazing work with, TensorFlow from Google and PyTorch from Facebook, to great open source machine learning, deep learning products, and all of the great work that IBM has provided for fairness and ethics in the open source data there. So it's all of these companies combined together to provide incredible infrastructure, incredible innovation, and ensure that it's fairness and ability of the data to be completely transparent.
Closing words, Rob?
I think my example is probably the grassroots. So I think what we've seen over the past year is a huge uptake in people's awareness about technology in dealing with access to education. So where EndlessOS Foundation works, we're trying to get people personal computers so they can learn, even if they don't have internet. But we're seeing huge use of free and open source software in refurbishing, donating computers, accessing resources offline. One of our partners, Learning Equality, makes some wonderful software called Calibri, that lets you actually download huge chunks of data, take it offline, and be able to learn and access that at home. So, cloud or on your desk, you can really kind of change the stakes with open source.
Well, that's very timely, given the strong pressures for people to learn more at home. And even if people go back to classrooms, we're never going to want to disconnect from the ability to learn at home as well.
Yeah, the whole landscape's changed in education, in work. Then we'll see even back to school. School will now be different if we can expect most children to have a computer, as they now do in many countries. And what does that mean for them in terms of connectivity, in terms of being able to access technology, understand it, control their data? Everything we've been talking about is now playing out, at a much greater speed and scale.
Final words, Amanda?
Just picking up on what Rob's saying there about digital inclusion and the added value that open is creating there, and the importance of it, both globally, but also here at home, and making sure that children have access to devices, Wi-Fi, and also to data. Absolutely critical.
I think we are now out of time, so I want to encourage the audience to look online to find out more about the projects of the panelists, and to look forward to seeing more progress with free and open source accelerating in the years ahead. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks so much.